Welcome to the latest of our short talks on medieval graffiti. Today we're going to be talking about ritual protection marks, and the title is Which Marks? Those Marks, the case for ritual protection. Tonight's talk is based upon studies that have been carried out for about the past decade, looking at church graffiti in English medieval churches. Um, I've been involved with this now for well over 10 years, and when we first began the project, we didn't really expect to find a great deal. However, the more we looked, the more we found. And essentially, the walls of our English medieval churches are absolutely covered in graffiti inscriptions. A lot of these inscriptions date back to the medieval period, but as you can see from the examples in front of you from Sedgeford in Norfolk, there's an awful lot of post-Reformation and post-medieval graffiti as well. In fact, the walls of our churches are covered in graffiti from essentially the day they were built until probably about last week. Now, a lot of the imagery that we're finding amongst the church graffiti is fairly orthodox. It's orthodox religious imagery. A lot of it is devotional in nature. So as with these examples you see in front of you from Flamstead in Hertfordshire, Carlisle Castle Keep and Troston in Suffolk, a lot of it is essentially mundane. It's crosses, the name of God, images of the saints, in this case possibly St Edmund, um, possibly St Sebastian. And some of this imagery really is bordering on the formal devotional imagery that you would find in your average church. As you'll see, these examples from Norwich Castle Keep are exceptionally deeply cut, and yet they are part of the informal decoration. Here we have on the left, you have the Virgin and Child. In the centre, you've got St Catherine with her wheel. And on the right, you have a very heavily eroded image of St Christopher with the Christ child on his shoulder. As I say, a lot of this imagery really is standard. It's what you'd find in the stained glass, it's what you'd find in the wall paintings, it's what you'll find in the medieval manuscripts. However, what I'm going to be talking about this evening is the other images we find, those markings, those symbols which are considered apotropaic in nature. Now, an apotropaic symbol is a symbol which is designed to ward off evil. It is designed to offer some form of spiritual protection. They're also sometimes known as ritual protection marks, or as they're still known in parts of the Baltic to this day, holy signs. Now, these make up, depending on where you are in the country, anywhere between 25% and 40% of all the markings you'll come across in the average medieval church. They really are quite extensive. Now, the one thing we don't call them are witch marks, despite what you might see in the media. A witch mark is actually the mark that was found on a witch's body, which was the physical manifestation of her compact with the devil. However, a decade or so ago, a journalist got hold of the idea that witch marks were related in some way to these graffiti symbols, and unfortunately, it has stuck. So these marks have nothing to do with witchcraft per se. If anything, they are really anti-witch marks. They ward off all forms of evil, of which witchcraft may be a part. Now, one of the most common of these apotropaic symbols we come across are these compass-drawn designs, these circular patterns, such as this rather wonderful example from Halton Church in Cambridgeshire. Now, sometimes they will just be simple circles, but a lot of the time they are these elaborate six-petal rosette designs, also sometimes referred to as a daisy wheel or as a hex foil. Um, all of those tend to be slightly pejorative terms, so I tend to use the more geometrically correct term of a six-petal rosette, which I'll be using throughout this talk. Now, these, as I say, really are one of the commonest motifs you'll find anywhere amongst the medieval graffiti. If you go into the average church and it has any surviving early inscriptions, the chances are that somewhere in there you will come across a compass drawn design. And some churches, such as Coolidge here in Suffolk, can have absolutely dozens of these motifs carved into the walls. And it's not just the walls. They can also be found on the woodwork, on the lead, and on the on the plasterwork. And in some cases, I've even seen one attempted in the stained glass itself. And they can be simple, they can be elaborate, they can vary in size from the minute to the exceptionally large. There really are no rules when it comes to some of these designs. Coolidge is perhaps unusual in the fact it has so many, but it isn't uncommon to go into a church which has a dozen or so of these. So, what do they actually mean? We describe them as being protective symbols, but what do these individual symbols actually mean? And does the meaning behind these symbols give some clue to their purpose? So what I'm going to quickly do here, it will be quite brief, is to really run through the evolution of one of these symbols. And in this case, I've chosen the 6-petal rosette because it has been so well researched. And the idea being here, perhaps, that by understanding where these symbols have evolved from, it might give us an insight into the way in which they were believed to function for the average member of a medieval congregation. Now, the 6-petal rosette is an ancient motif. Rosemary Hart has studied it right back into antiquity, but for this talk, I'm really going to start with the Roman period. Now, Martin Langer has studied the ancient graffiti found at Roman sites such as Pompeii and Herculaneum, and has created massive and extensive catalogues of these works. And the 6-petal rosette is amongst the most common single motif he discovered anywhere amongst the Roman graffiti. Sadly, he didn't do much in the way of, or offer much in the way of interpretation, rather than suggesting it might be a sun symbol, which is worth bearing in mind. It also turns up not just amongst the graffiti, but amongst the more formal items as well, in particular those which have a spiritual function or a religious function, such as the altar stone from Chester's Roman fort, seen here on the left, where the 6-petal rosette has been used to decorate the end of the pillow stones. And also on the right here from a grave marker, which is now in the museum at Vindolanda. And you can see the 6-petal rosette at the bottom there alongside the palm leaf, which is a symbol of victory. So these are being shown alongside other symbols which are considered spiritually significant. And they really are quite extensive across Western Europe in the Roman period. And in particular, they are, as I said, associated with items which are spiritually significant, such as the altar stones across the top. But they also appear on the more mundane items, the more everyday items, such as this wooden scraper, which is also in the museum at Vindolanda. Now, in the post-Roman period, these motifs and this symbol is adopted by the early Christian church. And one of the first places it really becomes noticeable, particularly in the 11th and 12th century, is as part of the formal decoration upon church fonts. Now, if it is a Roman sun symbol associated with rebirth, then it really isn't any great leap for the early Christian church to associate this with ideas of baptism, baptism and rebirth into the church again. There's almost a logic to it. But anyone who really knows or has spent much time looking at the art and architecture of the Western Europe in the 11th, 12th, and 13th century, this particular motif will really not be a stranger to them. It turns up absolutely everywhere, and it turns up on all sorts of objects. Now, I'm only going to talk about a couple of examples here, but the first is on church tympanum. Now, these tympanum are the large carved stones you will often see above church doorways. And they can obviously be carved in a variety of designs, some more elaborate than others. But as with this example from Little Paxton in Cambridgeshire, they often have a cross as their central motif. Except, of course, that sometimes they don't. In the case of Duxford Church, again in Cambridgeshire, they do have a large cross as a central motif, but in the centre of that is a 6-petal rosette. And moving across into Eggleton in Rutland, you'll note that the central cross has now been entirely replaced with the 6-petal rosette. So it's almost as though the rosette design is taking on the role of a cross. And it's not just with the tympanum. Recent studies of church consecration crosses have seen similar patterns emerge. For those of you who haven't come across a church consecration cross, essentially these date back to when the church was first built. So when you first built your church, it had to be consecrated or hallowed and made fit for Christian purpose. To do that, the bishop would have to turn up and he would anoint the walls of the church with holy oil or chrism. In the English tradition, he anointed it 12 times on the inside and 12 times on the outside. And often these crosses were quite high up on the walls, so you also got the amusing spectacle of watching a bishop in full regalia climb a rather rickety ladder. Now, the places where he anointed the walls were then marked with a cross. In England, these crosses are also often compass drawn. You'll quite often see them as these examples here from both from Norfolk again, as an equal armed cross. Early examples are often painted in green, whilst later examples, according to the church dictates, were painted in red. Now, there are many hundreds of these crosses that survive across the walls of our churches in England, but not all of them follow the same pattern. In fact, in some cases, it's not even a cross at all, but rather our 6-petal rosette. In at least half a dozen examples we've now discovered in England, the cross has been entirely replaced by the 6-petal rosette. So these two examples, the one on the left is from Eton in Norfolk, and the one on the right is from Colton, also in Norfolk. These are large painted crosses or painted designs on the wall of the church. These are obviously reconstructions, but the colours here are based upon the pigment analysis. So once again, we're seeing the cross being entirely replaced by the 6-petal rosette. And it isn't just on our consecration crosses and tympanum. Cross slabs are essentially grave covers. These are large carved stones which were set into the floor of our churches, covering a grave or a body. Now, these are relatively common in the north of England. There's fantastic collections in the counties of Cumbria, Derbyshire, and even into Yorkshire. Less common in East Anglia, less common in the southeast and southwest of England. Now, the design shown on these cross slabs tends to be fairly formulaic. The clue, as it were, is in the name. They usually show a cross. And as with these three examples here, the cross can, of course, vary in style, but it is essentially a cross, often set on a shaft. And as you'll see with the one on the right here, often on a stepped base. But once again, these cross slabs aren't all they're made out to be. In many cases, the cross has once again been entirely replaced with the 6-petal rosette. Or, as with the example on the right here, you have the large cross motif being augmented by the 6-petal rosette. So what we're seeing across these medium, the tympanum, the consecration crosses, the cross slabs, is that whilst the cross is the most common motif, it is sometimes replaced with the 6-petal rosette. And the suggestion has to be that the 6-petal rosette is nothing more than a replacement and occasional alternative to the cross. And that can be seen nowhere better, perhaps, than on some of the fonts of the period. Now, in West Norfolk, there is a fantastic collection of 12th century carved fonts. They are rather unimaginatively known as the West Norfolk group of fonts, and many people today still can't quite decide which fonts belong to this group or not. We have so many wonderful surviving examples. This example from Wareham in North Norfolk, up near the coast, is fairly typical of the style. And as you'll see, the face of the font itself has been decorated with a beautifully carved knotwork cross. This really is the pattern that's set across this whole group of fonts, except again, of course, for the ones where it isn't. At Toff Trees, a few miles outside Fakenham, again in North Norfolk, you'll see that each face of the font is decorated with a different motif. The face on the right here is exactly the same as we've just seen at Wareham. We have a knotwork equal armed cross, but each of the other faces displays a different form. That on the left is the east face, that which faces the altar. And you'll see that once again, we have a rather beautifully carved 6-petal rosette. A few miles to the north of this, at Sculthorpe, is perhaps my favourite example from all of this group of fonts. Now here, once again, each of the faces has a cross design or a knotwork design on it. This is the western face, and as you can see here, we don't just have one motif, but three. On the right is the equal arm knotwork cross that you saw at Toff Trees and at Wareham. On the left is our 6-petal rosette, and in the center we have another form of knotwork cross. So it seems fairly clear that we don't just have the 6-petal rosette, but we have a whole vocabulary of imagery which can all be used as alternatives and occasional replacements for the cross. So if these 6-petal rosettes are just simply a replacement for a cross, does that mean that they aren't apotropaic? Does that mean we should stop referring to them as being apotropaic images? Well, certainly not. The cross, which in the context of the Christian church is the most powerful apotropaic symbol of them all. The cross was used to consecrate a space to God. The cross was used to drive out demons. The cross was used in the medieval period as the universal symbol of protection from both spiritual and physical harm. And if you want to read some good examples of this, I can recommend the late 15th century Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches, written by Heinrich Kramer. And it contains numerous accounts, and I mean numerous, where the direct actions of the devil or demons are thwarted by the sign of the cross. One such account tells of an individual who confessed to a judge that he had tried to bring harm upon another man using witchcraft. But upon being summoned, the devil had declined his request to strike his enemy dead, stating that he was unable to do any of these things because the man was of good faith and diligently defended himself with the sign of the cross, and that therefore he could not harm him in his body. It really couldn't be clearer. The cross and these alternatives and replacements for the cross are powerful apotropaic symbols. But these alternative replacements for the cross, such as the 6-petal rosette, their power comes not from their own imagery, but the fact they draw upon the imagery of the cross. Now, leaving aside our 6-petal rosettes, I just want to look at a couple of other common apotropaic marks we find on the walls of our churches. Now, the first I'm going to look at briefly is pentangles. Now, pentangles today have a rather mixed reputation. Over the years, they have become associated with witchcraft, with black magic, with the dark arts, as it were. And finding them on the walls of our churches can certainly be, for some people, a little disturbing. Have our churches been used for black magic practices? Well, the simple answer is no. What you have to understand is that back in the medieval period, the pentangle was a religious symbol. It was a Christian symbol. It was one of the most Christian of symbols. And the reason we know this is it's one of the few apotropaic markings for which we actually have a written reference. Now, that written reference is actually a poem, Gawain and the Green Knight, which I'm sure many of you will already have come across the story. The poem was written in the late 14th century by an anonymous poet who is today known as the Pearl Poet, after another poem that he wrote. It's written, we think, in a Lancashire dialect, and it's written in the last decades of the 14th century. Now, the story of Gawain and the Green Knight, I'm not going to go into it in any great detail, but essentially it's a quest story. Gawain sets off to hunt down the Green Knight. And the poet gives an elaborate description of Gawain being armed to go off to hunt down the knight. And he talks about his horse, and he talks about his sword, and he talks about his helmet. And then he comes to his shield. And he says Gawain had a scarlet shield. And on that shield was painted a gold 5-pointed star, a 5-pointed pentangle. And the poet says, and now, even though it will interrupt the flow of my story, I will explain the symbolism of the pentangle. And he does. And yeah, it does interrupt the flow of his story. It carries on for about 20 lines. But what he does is gives us a complete breakdown of how the pentangle was seen in late 14th century Lancashire. And he says, it is a symbol of perfection. It is the seal of Solomon. It represents the 5 wounds of Christ, the 5 virtues of the knight, and the 5 fingers of the hand given by God to do good deeds. So it's wonderful in the fact that not only does it tell us what the pentangle means, but it also indicates that it means more than one thing. It isn't just one symbol means this or one symbol means that. It's far more nuanced than that. And this visual language of the Middle Ages was much more complex than we often give it credit for. So over the years, this symbol then evolves, and what begins as the most Christian of symbols later becomes associated with the dark arts. Now, one other symbol we're just going to briefly look at has become one of the most contentious of all the motifs we find amongst the apotropaic marks or even the graffiti on our church walls. And these are known as Conjoined V symbols. Now, they often look very much like a W, or they can be found inverted, as you see at the top right here, to look rather like an M. And there are a great many interpretations currently associated with this particular mark. It has been suggested that it represents the phrase Virgo Virginium and is associated with the Virgin Mary. It's also been known as a Marian mark. At the moment, though, it must be said that there's not a great deal of evidence to support either of those interpretations. It also turns up on Walsingham Ampulla, Walsingham being the most popular, or one of the most popular pilgrim destinations in medieval England. And it turns up on the churches in North Norfolk around Walsingham as well. So that is, perhaps another interpretation. Now, this particular symbol has caused quite a few problems because it does look rather like a W. And it gets slightly more complex than that, because when people were writing the letter W in the Middle Ages, and even later when they started to print books, they often write the letter W as a VV motif. So 2 examples here in front of you. The first on the left is from 1559. It's a capital letter from William Cunningham's Cosmographical Glass, which was a treatise on map making and land surveying. The example on the right is Kellam's faithfully translated into English version of the Holy Bible, published in about 1609, 1610. And as you can see where they've been circled there, you've got W's being written as VV motifs. So this, of course, leads to quite a few problems. Essentially, when people go out looking for graffiti and they see these marks on the wall that look like conjoined Vs, the immediate reaction is that these markings must in some way be ritually significant. They must have some spiritual dimension to them. With examples such as the one at the top left, the more mundane interpretation would be that this is initials. You have the letters WS with a 17th century date carved above them. However, there is this idea that because it's a VV symbol, it must therefore be, spiritually significant. And this has led to an awful lot of confusion. Essentially, when people have gone into any place and they've seen a lot of post-Reformation graffiti inscriptions, which have included Ws or VV symbols, they have interpreted it as being in some way associated with ritual protection. Rather than just using the more mundane interpretation that these are initials we're looking at, they've tried to ascribe some deeper religious meaning to it. And as we've all seen in the media recently, that can lead to some awful complications. So are these just initials we're seeing on the walls of our churches and our cathedrals? Well, the general idea would be that yes, they are, until you start looking a little bit closer. When we carried out the survey at Norwich Cathedral, we recorded all the inscriptions in the ground floor area, essentially everywhere that was publicly accessible. As part of that, we looked at all the letter inscriptions, and we started to notice some rather strange patterns appearing. What you're looking at in front of you is a frequency analysis of the first letters of the individual letter inscriptions found in Norwich Cathedral. And as you can see, it is a rather strange pattern. 4 letters, I-J, R, T, and W, appear far more frequently than any of the others. So what's going on? Is there, this looks like more than mere chance. And many of those people who ascribe ritual significance to much of this lettering on the walls of our churches, cathedrals, and caves say that these markings on these letters are turning up far too often, far too commonly for it just to be random chance. So having seen this at Norwich Cathedral, I was obviously intrigued. I then came across the work being undertaken down at Rochester Cathedral by Jacob Scott. And Jacob too had noticed a rather strange pattern appearing amongst the graffiti inscriptions on the walls of his building. And it was essentially the same pattern that we were seeing at Norwich Cathedral. So what was going on? Essentially, the letters I and J, which were interchangeable until well into the 18th, 19th century, R, T, W, and S, which appears to have fallen off the bottom of the slide, were turning up. Well, they were accounting for about 80% of all the first letter inscriptions. Spooky. Surely not everyone before the 20th century was called John. So the only way of really checking this and seeing what was going on was to cross-reference it with other material. And what we needed to do was analyze the first name or Christian name patterns in England from the late Middle Ages all the way through into the 19th century. Now, obviously, this is long before we start having a national census. So we had to look elsewhere for our data. Now, the first place we looked at was memorial brasses, all created prior to 1600. We had a sample size of 1,663. And once again, we looked at all the initial letters. And as you can see, the same pattern emerged. We then looked at the wills from the Archdeaconry of Sudbury between 1439 and 1474, sample size of 1,421 examples. And again, we were seeing the same patterns, the same letters turning up more frequently than any of the others. We then looked at the military survey for Suffolk from 1522. We saw the same pattern. And I can keep going on here. We looked at the Norwich census for the poor in 1570, same pattern. the lay subsidy, 1581, and the hearth tax returns for Darlington South East Division in 1666. And in all cases, we were seeing the same 4/5 letters turning up amongst the records, indicating essentially that what we were looking at were Christian names, that people were simply, had very few Christian names. People were all called the same. Well, it actually turned out that all this hard work and all this statistical analysis had already been done. We were simply replicating via the graffiti studies other more detailed academic work. So a more detailed study of late 14th century Christian names, covering the period 1377 to 1381, and drawing on over 10,000 records from southern England, demonstrated that the names John, William, Thomas, Richard, and Robert accounted for over 70% of all the recorded male names, with John alone accounting for 35% of the total. Now, our studies could actually take that slightly further. In the case of the wills of the Archdeaconry of Sudbury, it was closer to 80%, and about 40% of all the men who were writing wills in the Archdeaconry of Sudbury for that period were called John. It really was as simple as that. So, are all the names on the walls of our churches and cathedrals, are all these letters simply people's Christian names? Well, the only real way to check this was to carry out some control studies. And the controls we undertook were looking at 3 cathedrals in France. Cathedrals in France, of course, would be also covered in graffiti, but the Christian name traditions would be different. So if we were seeing the same patterns in the French cathedrals that we were seeing in the English cathedrals, then perhaps there was some ritual significance to these markings. If we were seeing different patterns that also reflected local Christian name traditions, then what we were looking at was simply names on the walls. And that's exactly what we found. In the 3 cathedrals we studied, they had a similar amount of graffiti, a similar amount of letter graffiti, but the patterns were different. And those patterns corresponded almost exactly to the local Christian name tradition. So it turns out that most of these inscriptions on the walls of our churches, the letter inscriptions on the walls of our churches, are in fact simply people making their mark, people leaving their name. However, there was an interesting side effect of this research. The patterns that we were seeing at Rochester and the patterns we were seeing in Norwich Cathedral and the patterns we also saw in Lincolnshire churches and in Suffolk churches all corresponded to the male Christian name tradition. The female Christian name tradition, of course, was different, and we weren't seeing that amongst the graffiti. So the suggestion that this research has put forward is that in our post-Reformation graffiti inscriptions, at least, the vast majority of these letter inscriptions appear to be made by men. Now, this is obviously avenues for further research, but it's certainly thrown up something which we didn't expect to find. So where then does this lead, or where then does this leave the case for the study of the wider study of apotropaic graffiti? Has the whole concept been flushed down the pan? Well, the evidence does seem pretty clear. The graffiti doesn't sit in a separate bubble universe from the rest of medieval art and symbolism, but is actually a direct reflection of that wider context. So if it's pairs of letters, they are most probably initials. Most of the other symbols are derived directly from the wider symbolism of the medieval church. In the case of something like the 6-petal rosette, it's a well-documented alternative to the cross or crucifix. So there really is no need for some of the more wildly speculative interpretations of recent years. No mystic flowers of life, no Marian roses or Marian symbols, just the imagery of the medieval church. It really is that simple. Let's face it, the imagery of the medieval church is quite freaky enough without trying to improve upon it. So this concept also applies to the wider study of medieval church imagery. The graffiti is just one small part of a wider language of faith and belief, a language that can only be understood by looking beyond the boundaries of one medium. It is quite literally written on the walls. However, it does leave us with one still rather pressing question. What happens to these symbols in the post-Reformation period? We can prove that they continued in use, particularly on vernacular buildings, but does their meaning remain the same? Is someone creating a six-petal rosette in the middle of the 18th century on a country house like Knowle still doing it because they believe it's a cross or a crucifix? Some writers have suggested that this may well be the case, that the loyalty to the old Catholic ways continued long after Henry VIII was rotting in his oversized grave. Or did these symbols, like the pentangle, as we've seen, undergo an evolution of belief? Did the symbols continue on, but as mere dumb symbols, having lost their original associations? Nothing more than symbols and motifs that were simply regarded as lucky, a lucky charm. Well, the evidence that there is would suggest the latter was the case. But that's another story and for another talk. So if you would like to read anything more about some of the things I've been talking tonight, if you'd like to know more about consecration crosses and the rite of consecration, I can strongly recommend Laura Varnum's wonderful book, The Church as Sacred Space in Middle English Literature and Culture. Contains almost an entire chapter just on consecration. If you'd like to know more about medieval cross slabs, I can recommend any of the books by Peter Ryder, who has carried out an extensive study of the surviving cross slabs in the north of England. And if you'd like to know anything more about medieval graffiti, well, a few years ago, some bloke wrote a book about it, Medieval Graffiti, The Lost Voices of Britain's Churches. Lastly, if you'd like to see some more examples and look at some of the interpretation for some of our graffiti inscriptions, do take a look at the website, www.medievalgraffiti.co.uk, or you can follow us on Twitter @MedievalG. Many thanks for listening.